this. We have all our speakers, so.
Great. Well, welcome all to this, to the Princeton-Bucharest seminar. And today we are actually very privileged to have a number of distinguished scholars who are going to be talking about Spinoza's Herem, which has been recently revisited, and you'll hear all about that. Jonathan Israel, Yitzhak Melamed, Steve Nadler, Ronit Palash, and Pete Steinbacher are going to be the speakers, not in that order. And the first speaker will be Steve Nadler. We're going to do all of the presentations first, and then at the end there will be hopefully a lot of time for discussion. So Steve, why don't you begin?
All right, thanks, Dan. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. Right. So I'm going to begin with the text of the Herem document. And I want you to pay very careful attention to this translation. This will be appearing in volume 3 of Spinoza's collected writings, along with a translation of the Hebrew grammar. And I'm hoping that this will henceforth serve as the standard translation of the Herem, because I think it does a better job of capturing the text both in word and in spirit. So the Senhores of the Muhammad make known to you, having received, having for some time, reports of the bad opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, they have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his bad ways. But being unable to effect any remedy, on the contrary, each day receiving more information about the abominable heresies which he practiced and taught, and about the monstrous deeds which he performed, and having many trustworthy witnesses who have reported and testified on all of this in the presence of the said Spinoza, who has been found guilty. After all of this has been examined in the presence of the rabbis, they, the members of the Muhammad, have decided with the rabbis' consent, that the said Spinoza should be banned and separated from the nation of Israel, as they now put him under Herem with the following Herem. With the judgment of the angels and with that of the saints, we put under Herem, ostracize and curse and damn Baruch to Spinoza with the consent of blessed God and with the consent of this entire holy congregation before these holy scrolls with the 613 precepts which are written in them, with the Herem that Joshua put upon Jericho, with the curse with which Elisha cursed the youth, and with all the curses that are written in the law. Cursed be he by day, cursed be he by night, cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he goes out, when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. Adonai will not forgive him. The fury and zeal of Adonai will burn against this man and bring upon him all the curses that are written in this book of the law. And may Adonai erase his name from under the heavens. And may Adonai separate him for evil from all of the tribes of Israel, with all of the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the law. And you that cleave unto Adonai your God, all of you alive today, we warn that no one should communicate with him orally or in writing, nor provide him any favor, nor be with him under the same roof, nor be within 4 cubits of him, nor read any paper composed or written by him. And with this writ of Herem, the 23-year-old Bento de Spinoza, or Baruch de Spinoza, was now formally and irrevocably expelled from the Talmud Torah congregation of Amsterdam. Now, you'll notice, for those of you who have seen other translations of the text, you'll notice a word here is missing. The punishment that Spinoza received is commonly called an excommunication, and translations of the Herem document typically have the Parnasim, that is the lay leaders of the community, declaring that they are excommunicating Spinoza. And the original, let's see if I can move this forward. The original legal document from which the wording of Spinoza's Herem was drawn, this was adapted from a medieval rabbinic compendium and translated from Hebrew into Spanish in 1618 when it was brought to Amsterdam from Venice by Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera, who was concerned that a Herem or two might be useful to deal with trouble in his Beth Jacob congregation. And so this text, as you can see, in Spanish, even uses the term excommunicate. Among the phrases in Mortera's text are, we excommunicate and expel, separate, destroy, and curse. And with the excommunication with which Joshua excommunicated Jericho. And so obviously this text is perfectly comfortable with the word excommunication. And it was on hand in Amsterdam around the time that Spinoza was put under the ban. And the wording is so close, obviously it served as a kind of model. But the Amsterdam Sephardim in 1656, however, seem to have gone out of their way to avoid using the Portuguese cognate for excommunicate. And as far as I can tell, all of the community's extant Herem documents of the period, which are now nicely transcribed in a recent publication out of Lisbon, all of these documents, including Spinoza's, prefer some form of the phrase put under Herem. And even, it seems, they took the shoresh, or the root letters of the Hebrew, chet, resh, and mem, and invented a Portuguese verb, en hermar, to put under Herem. Perhaps this Jewish community of former conversos, that is, Jews forcibly converted and compelled to live as Catholics in Spain and Portugal, avoided using such a Catholic-loaded term as excommunication. After all, Judaism does not have any communion, and so no excommunication proper. Moreover, a Herem typically was more extensive than Catholic excommunication. With a Herem, one was not merely deprived of participation in liturgical and sacramental practices, such as serving in a minyan or prayer quorum, or being called to the Torah in synagogue, but a Herem affected practically all religious, social, even economic aspects of an individual's life. Financial dealings, or even conversations with a person under Herem was restricted, and so the individual could not engage in ordinary social and business affairs. He or she was truly cut off from being an active member of the community. Unlike a typical Catholic excommunication, too, punishment by Herem was attached not only to offenses involving liturgical behavior or religious doctrine. Indeed, Amsterdam Sephardim employed the Herem quite broadly over a range of offenses. A Herem was primarily attached to the violation of certain rules regarding religious and devotional matters, such as attendance at the synagogue, the observance of the dietary laws of kashrut, and observance of the holidays. But a Portuguese Jew in Amsterdam could also earn a Herem for more mundane transgressions. For example, it was forbidden under pain of Herem to buy meat from an Ashkenazic butcher. And then there were ethical regulations. One could be banned for gambling or for lewd behavior in the streets. Social precepts protected by the ban included a rule against marrying in secret, that is, without parental consent and not in the presence of a rabbi. There were also regulations deriving from the political and financial structure of the community. One could be put under the ban for failing to pay one's taxes, for shady business dealings, or for showing disrespect to a member of the governing board. Women were forbidden under threat of Herem to cut the hair of Gentile women, and members of the community were warned not to engage Gentiles in theological discussions. Sexual relations between Jews and Gentiles were also prohibited under pain of Herem. I have to say, one of the most interesting cases is the case of a Sephardic man who was put under Herem, and the document simply specifies for circumcising a Polish man without permission. And we can only hope it was not without the Polish man's permission. The text of the Herem then exceeds all others. The text of Spinoza's Herem exceeds all the others proclaimed in the community in its vehemence and fury. There is no other Herem document of the period issued by the Amsterdam Sephardic community that contains the wrath and curses directed at Spinoza when he was expelled from the congregation. More typical was the Herem against Isaac de Peralta, which he received for assaulting one of the members of the governing board in the street. Peralta got off relatively easy. And this is for a physical assault. The Mahamad merely declared him under Herem and said, no one shall talk or deal with him, Only family and other members of his household may talk with him. After 4 days, Peralta begged forgiveness, paid a fine of 60 guilders, and the Herem was lifted. In Spinoza's case, by contrast, there seems to be no hope of reconciliation, no amends that could be made to have the Herem lifted. Spinoza was out for good. Now, the obvious question, of course, is why? Why was Spinoza banned with such extreme prejudice? Neither the Herem text nor any document from the period tells us exactly what his bad opinions and acts were supposed to have been, nor what abominable heresies or monstrous deeds he is alleged to have taught and practiced. Spinoza never refers to this period of his life as in his extant letters, although we would love to see all those letters that were destroyed by his friends when they published his posthumous writings. And thus he himself does not offer his correspondence or us any clues about why he was expelled. There's thus a bit of a mystery here. Odette Vlessing, a former archivist for Amsterdam's Portuguese Jewish archives, has argued that Spinoza's Herem was directly related to machinations he undertook to avoid financial obligations. In March 1656, just 4 months before the ban, Spinoza initiated drastic steps to relieve himself of debts that he had inherited along with the estate of his late father, Michael. He took advantage of a Dutch law that protected underage children who had lost their parents. Because he was a year and a few months shy of his 25th birthday, he was still legally a minor. Spinoza was thus able to file a petition with the civil Dutch authorities and be declared an orphan. And the orphan masters of the city of Amsterdam then appointed a guardian for him who successfully argued that he should be discharged from any obligations he might have incurred by initially settling some of his father's debts. Here is the document that the city filed. Now, according to Vlessing, Spinoza's legal maneuver threatened the Jewish community's general reputation for trustworthiness in business affairs, something that it counted on heavily in its relationship with the Dutch. And it was not only Dutch creditors on his father's estate whose expectations would not be met. Spinoza was also shirking financial commitments to fellow Portuguese Jewish merchants. In other words, Spinoza, the son of a one-time Parnasse, was going over the heads of the sitting Parnassim and putting Dutch law above communal regulations, which stipulated that business disputes should be handled within the community. And he was also going above Jewish law, Vlessing argues, and she sees this as a very serious offense indeed. And she concludes that Michael Spinoza's financial disaster and Baruch Spinoza's appeal for release from his father's estate on the grounds of minority must have shaken the Jewish community tremendously. I think Vlessing makes a plausible and compelling case. However, the text of Spinoza's Herem suggests rather explicitly that his offense was more than just a matter of business and financial irregularities, or even communal behavior that violated Jewish law. After all, the document, as we saw, refers to his abominable heresies and bad opinions. Vlessing insists that Spinoza was not excommunicated on account of his philosophical ideas. However, given the wording of the ban, and not to mention its length, its vitriol, its uniqueness, and its finality, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it was precisely Spinoza's ideas that he was communicating viva voce among the community that occasioned the final and irrevocable ostracism. Evidence that this is so is found in the two very well-known reports by now that two Spanish visitors to Amsterdam in 1658 made to the Inquisition upon their return to Spain. The Augustinian monk, Thomas Soldano y Robles, and a military captain named Miguel Pérez de Maltranilla. I'm trying to get the document up here. There. Both told the inquisitors in Spain that in Amsterdam they met someone named Spinoza, and that he claimed that he had once been observant of Jewish law, but after a change of mind was expelled from the synagogue because of his views on God, the soul, and the law. He said he had, in the eyes of the congregation, reached the point of atheism. Those are Spinoza's words to these visitors, allegedly. Well, what does any of this mean? If we take as our guide Spinoza's philosophical writings, which probably everyone at this Zoom meeting is familiar with, It's not very difficult to imagine the kinds of things he must have been thinking and probably saying around late 1655 and early 1656. Thus, in the Ethics, Spinoza basically denies that the human soul is immortal, as I read it at least, in the sense of enjoying a life after death. Thus, there's nothing to hope for or anything to fear in terms of eternal reward and punishment. Indeed, the notion of God acting as a judge who dispenses either mundane or eternal reward and punishment is based on an absurd anthropomorphizing. In truth, Spinoza insists, God is simply the infinite eternal substance in which all things exist, and as such is identical with nature itself. Everything else follows from God or nature with an absolute necessity. And the whole notion of a supernatural providential God is nothing but a pernicious fiction. Then there are Spinoza's views on the Bible. One of the primary lessons of the theological political treatise, published anonymously to great alarm in 1670, is that the Pentateuch was not in fact authored by Moses, nor are its precepts literally of divine origin. The Hebrew Bible is the work of a number of human authors, writing in different historical periods and different political contexts, and later editors. And the text we have is the product of a natural process of historical transmission. Spinoza also maintains that if the Jewish people were elected in any meaningful sense, it is only a matter of their having achieved through perfectly natural causes a temporal physical happiness and autonomous government during the era of the ancient commonwealth and kingdoms. With God or nature's help, they were able to preserve themselves for an extended period of time as a nation, surrounded as they were by weak enemies, and as a cohesive political and social unit under certain laws. However, the notion of the Jews as a chosen people has no metaphysical or moral significance, and whatever natural advantages they did and do happen to enjoy is not necessarily something unique to them. As for the laws of Torah, these, he insists, are no longer binding or valid for latter-day Jews, because with the end of the Jewish Commonwealth and the destruction of the temple, most of the 613 mitzvot have lost their raison d'etre. And these are not likely sentiments to endear one to the rabbis and lay leaders of a Jewish community in the 17th century. All right, so I've used up my 15 minutes and I will stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Second speaker will be Pete Steinbacher.
You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Can you hear me now clearly? Yeah?
Yes.
Good. Well, why revisit Spinoza's Herem? On a symposium with the title The Spinoza Case, organized by Ronit Palash, who is now also on the panel, on 6th December 2015, the issue was discussed from a range of different perspectives. The symposium itself followed upon an investigation held by the Portuguese Israelite community of Amsterdam in 2012-2013, for which they asked an international team of scholars, Joseph Kaplan, Jonathan Israel, Steve Nadler, and me, again, apart from Joseph Kaplan, all present on the panel now, to provide them with the full facts of the case. Herem Toledano, the chief rabbi, then advised the Amsterdam Ma'amat not to rescind Spinoza's Herem, and they obliged. Since then, no new facts about the Herem itself have come to light. That it has nevertheless come to the surface again as a topical issue is because of a curious incident. On 28 November 2021, Yitzhak Melamed, also on the panel, received a letter from the Amsterdam rabbi Joseph Sarfati, denying him entrance to the Portuguese Israelite synagogue to make a film about Spinoza. According to Sarfati, Spinoza and his writings had been excommunicated, and I quote from his letter, with the severest possible ban, a ban that remains in force for all time and cannot be rescinded, unquote. And Melamed's request was, quote, an unacceptable assault on our identity and heritage, unquote. The rabbi's decision elicited indignant reactions worldwide, but also within the Portuguese Israelite community itself. Shortly afterwards, Sarfati was dismissed and Yitzhak was allowed in after all. At the 2015 symposium, I was one of the few who argued for lifting the Herem, or at least making a gesture of some sort. Some people maintain that Spinoza himself would not have appreciated a posthumous rescission of the Herem. That, however, is beside the point. Since he died, now 345 years ago, he is no longer a party to this issue. Spinoza's death in 1677 made the exclusion of his person from the Jewish community around him irreversible. One can also say that his death cancelled the ban in practice by nullifying its disciplinary function. The only other immediately practical implication of the Herem that remained was the prohibition to read anything Spinoza wrote. Its wording, however, does not specify any sanctions for disobeying this order, and it has generally been ignored. Here again, to all intents and purposes, the ban no longer pertains in practice. Lifting the ban, then, would only be a symbolic gesture. Even so, as the recent commotion about Yitzhak's visit to the Amsterdam synagogue shows, it would be far from meaningless. Though pronounced by a very small number of people in the distant past, the ban claims that, and I quote, "the Lord will separate Spinoza to his injury from all the tribes of Israel," unquote. And this is precisely, I think, why the ban will continue to be a bone of contention. It speaks on behalf of, and thereby involves, Jewish people at large, the vast majority of whom nowadays do not appear to have any qualms in acknowledging Spinoza as part and parcel of their cultural heritage. In 2012, Daniel Schwartz published an excellent study of the Jewish reception of Spinoza, the first modern Jew. And in 2019, he edited a volume of essential texts on the same subject, Spinoza's Challenge to Jewish Thought, published by Brandeis University Press. According to Schwartz, the history of Jewish thought, and I quote here, Jewish thought from the Enlightenment to today can be read as an extended response to Spinoza's challenge to Judaism. End quote. This response is determined first and foremost by, quote, the scandal and enigma of his excommunication as a heretic by the Sephardic congregation of Amsterdam in 1656 and the fallout from this rupture, unquote. Jewish assessments of Spinoza's thought, in Schwartz's account, range from the position that Spinoza was substantively a Jewish philosopher to the argument that the gulf between his thought and Judaism is unbridgeable. His legacy, too, is disputed. Some see Spinoza as the first modern Jew, others, and this notably Hermann Cohen, as the founder of modern anti-Semitism. As Schwartz observes, the complicated Jewish reception of Spinoza is linked to, I quote, the difficulty of defining Jewishness at all, a problem that has mushroomed as a result of the proliferation of Jewish identities in the modern world, unquote. In the 2021 episode, even the request to visit the Amsterdam synagogue with the intention to make a film about Spinoza was considered, I quote again, an unacceptable assault on our identity and heritage. Given such sensitivities, it is highly unlikely that the Herem will ever fade into oblivion. In view of the stature of Spinoza as one of the greatest philosophers in history, it is rather sad to conclude that the Herem will remain a highly divisive issue and that new quarrels will be inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete. The next speaker will be Yitzhak Lament. Yitzhak?
Yes, for some reason I thought that I was supposed to be last, but that's fine. I mean, let me share with you my PowerPoint. Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So first of all, I just wanted to thank Dan, Dana, and Claudia for the very kind invitation. And secondly, let me say that I'll be delighted to discuss my pretty amusing recent Herem at the QAA, but now I prefer to go into the more serious business. Just one small correction to the point that some of the issues that Pete mentioned. I was not allowed to film in the synagogue, just to make things clear. I mean, the board of the Parnasim of the synagogue, all secular, none of them observant, 6 Parnasim, they decided they fired Sarfati, but they also stick to their tradition, and therefore I'm not allowed to mention the word Spinoza in the synagogue. So just to make things clear, I can say Spit, I can say Noza, I cannot say Spinoza. That's just as a matter of fact. So, but again, I'll get to that later, which is, it's pretty much striking me. I mean, well, we'll talk about that. So there are numerous secular Spinoza fairy tales. I think anyone who studied Spinoza knows that it's, especially the reception of Spinoza, there are all kinds of, stories which are, Pete will give you just a list of these kinds of dozens of stories that I think they are just fairy tales. And I think it's important to get the facts right. I mean, to try to get rid of the fairy tales and just have a reasonable sense of the real facts. For 2 reasons. One of them is I'm not in the business of providing support for ideology. So whether it's an ideology of Zionism, Marxism, whatever, that's not my business. I mean, I'm trying really to understand what happened there. And actually, I think that our knowledge of what really happened there is quite limited, and probably intentionally so. We'll say a word about that. The other thing is, I do not also wish to trade with anti-Semitic tropes. And the story of the Herem on Spinoza, at least partly, was used as an anti-Semitic trope. Or I suspect that it was used, because still we need to know what really happened there. Until we really know what happened there, it's possible that that many of the stories we heard are true. It's also possible that there are anti-Semitic tropes. Now, one last point as a preliminary: the study of the Herem affair requires knowledge rather than stereotypes, and it's especially knowledge of their relevant context, which is, at least in part, rabbinic reasoning and practice. And this we would like to really understand, and I'll try to see again. I'll try to say a few words about Herem in rabbinic practice. So I won't have much time for that today, but again, I'll be happy to answer questions about that. It's a totally understudied topic, just to make the point clear. 3 years ago, I've organized a conference on the history and the practice of Herem, and hopefully we'll have a collection of essays coming out of that. Okay, so let's move ahead. I was fortunate that Steve presented the text of the Herem, so I can I think the version I'm using is probably the translation by the spouse of Paul Mendes Floor. Instead of just repeating the text, which I'll just, being grateful to Steve, I'll avoid mentioning anything apart from, 2 quick points. So, first of all, I totally agree with Steve. In fact, I made this claim several times in a talk that you can find on the web over the past 3 years, where I was saying it's wrong to describe the Herem as excommunication, among other reasons, because when we look at the Jewish Portuguese that the Herem is using, so instead of using the terminology of excommunication, they're just taking the word Herem and declining it as if it was a Portuguese word. So it seems that they are basically understanding that Herem is somewhat different. How different is a good question, but I think Herem is somewhat different from excommunication, and I'm delighted so again, that you can see a more detailed discussion of that in a talk you'll find on the web titled "Why Isn't Spinoza Excommunicated?" I elaborate on this issue. I think, I agree with most of what I've seen in the translation that Steve suggested. Seems to me right. There is a decrees of angels and command of, I would prefer holy men still rather than saints, because originally the phrase was Gzirat Irin Kadishin. It's not clear whether holy is referring to human beings or to the angels. But I'll put that aside. I mean, that's a tiny, small issue. It's Meimar Kadishin, there is a decree and command which are not the same. Okay, all this is less important. What is important is that when you look at the text of rabbinic documents, a lot of times these documents have a distinction between what they call tofes and toref. The tofes is a formula. It's a formula that is universal. You use the same formula almost in all cases. The toref gives you the specific application to a specific person in a specific case. This distinction is made in all kinds of rabbinic documents, whether bills of divorce, bills of marriage, whatever. I mean, it's very, very, very common. I suspect that something similar also happens in the case of Herems. It's very common to claim that in Spinoza, that the Herem on Spinoza was the most horrible ever pronounced in Amsterdam. Blessing is claiming that is not the case. She is citing Solomon, who claims that the very same formula was used in Beit Jacob about 30, 40 years earlier. The truth is that I simply need to see the text in order to be able to judge that. But there are two things which I can already tell you right now. The formula, which is a magical formula, it's really the aim of this formula is just to threaten the person, nothing more than that. Okay, so the formula itself is taken from a text. There is nothing new about it. It's taken from a text from the 14th century. We now know the name of the author of that text. There are many mysteries about how this text was formed, etc., but we'll put that aside. Now, the question is whether it is really indeed the most horrible Herem ever pronounced, and I doubt it. Why? Because what we see in the bill of actions of the Jewish community in Amsterdam, a lot of times in the records, we see that there is an announcement on Herem, but that's not the Herem itself. It's just a record of the fact that this Herem, something was pronounced. What you have here, in the case of Spinoza, we also have the text itself, the pronouncement of the magical formula, okay? Now, what I would like to do would be interesting for me to see whether the magical formula or the common text, which is applied in other cases, is different. I'm not sure. All I can say, I doubt it. Okay, so now, few other crucial observations, which is much more important than what I've said so far. So, the document in the case of the Herem and Spinoza does not spell out the concrete reasons for the Herem, and that's very much unlike other documents that you find in the Herem on Spinoza, in the Heremot in Amsterdam. And the question is why? It seemed, at least my impression, is that the document goes to some length in order not to spell out what happened. We know that it is related to horrible deeds and abominable opinions. I might be, so let's see, evil opinions and horrible obras or acts, right? Of course, the question is what precisely are obras, but what this gives us is that it's extremely important that the reason for the Herem should combine actions and heresies, right? The repetition of these two elements appears several times. We have it several times, and therefore any good explanation should include both of these. Another question is why there are no signatures on the document, right? I mean, in other cases of Herem, we do have signatures. We just a few pages before that, when you look at the records of the community, there are signatures. Why? Why is there no signature in the case of Spinoza? I have a quick discussion. I don't know whether I have much time for that. So there are three theories basically about what was the reason for the Herem on Spinoza. One is pantheism, very common in the popular imagination. The second one is Cartesianism. And the third one was suggested by Stephen, and that's the denial of personal immortality. So with regard to pantheism and Cartesianism, I think they are just literally unfound. I mean, there is hardly anything that can support them. all this being said, I have to warn you, as long as you don't have the actual documents, I cannot say anything totally to be absolutely convinced. But pantheism, on the face of it, seems to be extremely bizarre reason for Herem. Why? Just to give you one reason is that pantheism itself was extremely common among the rabbis of the Jewish community in Amsterdam. So unless they're going to put Avraham Cohen Herrera on Herem, as well as Shaul Motera, or Shaul Motera putting himself on Herem, shouldn't be the reason. That because they quote and they use pantheistic formula time and again. Cartesianism, the suggestion by Kasher and Biderman, also does not work, to my mind, does not have any kind of support, because when you look, for example, to the library of Israel Aboab de Fonesca, Aboab de Fonesca, you see Descartes' works are there. I mean, these are not rabbis that are not reading philosophical work. I mean, not only they are reading philosophical work, but they have in the library of Aboab de Fonesca, you have a wonderful collection of the most radical Averroists within the rabbinic world. So is he someone who would not read philosophy? Not really. I mean, there is no evidence for that. And of course, the other thing which is important in this context is that neither the pantheism nor the Cartesianism provides any explanation for the obras. What are the actions? What really are the actions that started the entire story? Now, the suggestion of Stephen is in a better position than the first two because it has the testimony of the sailor and the monk before the Inquisition, and I think I take this testimony seriously. Although I think that there are some problems with this source, we can discuss that. But one thing I can say is that it's possible that the issue of immortality played some role there. I don't think it's the cause. What is the main cause? Why I don't think it's the cause? Because bans based on opinions are not common. They appear, there are some, but they are not common in the rabbinic context. Secondly, the view that denies personal immortality is so common among the Averroists in Jewish philosophy, and these medieval Averroists were respectable rabbis. So unless you're going to put on Herem, all kinds of rabbis in the 13th, 14th century, it will be difficult to start banning all of those figures who viewed a personal immortality as a nice fairy tale that should be preached only to the masses or something like that. And the last point, which is, again, most important, is the immortality explanation in itself does not tell us anything about the actions. What are the obras? Now, I have 5 more minutes to think, so I hope so. I'll just do it very quickly. I think that
Yitzhak,
yeah,
we're actually a little bit ahead of time, so don't worry about the time.
Oh, thank you so much. But I have 3 scans, so I'll be done. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dan. Again, I'm grateful to Stephen for discussing the Vlessing thesis. And again, I'll open my cards. I think that the document pointed out by Vlessing is a key to what happened, but it does not tell us everything. And so I agree with much of Stephen's criticism. I'll explain it in half a second. But this being said, I think that this is really the key for what happened, and I'll explain why I think so. So we're talking about an event that took place in March 16, 1656, which means 3.5 months before the Herem on Spinoza, precisely 3.5 months, okay? Spinoza is 23 years old. He's pronounced an orphan by the insolvency chamber of the Amsterdam municipality, and he's appointed, and he's having the head of the insolvency chamber, whom he apparently didn't know before, appointed as his guardian at the age of 23. Spinoza, in addition to that, Spinoza is also claiming that his father owed him a share in his mother's inheritance, which he didn't pay. Okay. Now, let me explain. So, first of all, the claims of Oded Vlessing are that this act of Spinoza, one, undermined the economic trust and the regular operation in the community. And I think that's probably right, but I don't think that in itself would be a reason for the Herem. I mean, it's a reason for many people to be angry at Spinoza. It's a reason for many people to wish him all kinds of horrible things. But that's not in itself will be a reason that will allow the rabbinic the rabbinic establishment to start in the process of Herem, as far as I can see. Secondly, she claims that there was some sort of dishonoring of his father, and again, it's a nice suggestion, but I'm not aware of Herems based on dishonoring the father or just not loving your neighbor. These are the kind of things, perhaps it would have been better if things were like that, but they are not. I mean, I've seen any evidence, I'm not aware of any evidence of Herem pronounced on this context. And the third one, according to Vlessing, is that Spinoza broke the Jewish law regarding the age of majority. According to Jewish law, usually the age of majority is either 18 or 20. There is a debate there. But what kind of breaking, I mean, if someone is not pronouncing himself to be 23 and therefore a minor, so the point I will try to say, to develop right now is, I think she is right, but not precisely for the 3 points that she's making here. Now, I would argue that neither of these considerations would itself result normally in a Herem. Still, I would argue in all likelihood, the Vlessing document began a chain of events that culminated with the Herem. Why so? Okay, so the most common reason for Herem in Amsterdam and outside Amsterdam, and I think even perhaps not today, but is the breaking of the autonomy of the Jewish community. Okay, that's time and again, that's the tool the Jewish community is able to use in order to make sure that members of the community use the rabbinic court rather than any kind of secular court, whether Jewish or whether Gentile or Jewish, because the same also applies to, for example, to anyone who will appeal to their secular authorities of the State of Israel if he's doing that without getting permission from the rabbinic court. So litigation in a non-rabbinic court without getting previous permission from the rabbinic authorities is a subject, and it happened many times, well, that due to this kind of activity, a person would be put on Herem. And this is precisely what Spinoza did by appealing to the authorities of the city of Amsterdam. In addition, I suspect that in picking a guardian who is not a member of the community, meaning the head of the local insolvency chamber, and again, according to my understanding is that when we have similar cases of minor Jews who are minor or orphans, they always pick a guardian within the community. Okay, so Spinoza makes clear that he does not want anyone from the community to care for his business. He wants to make clear that no one is going to tell him what to do. At least that's the way I read it. And the question is, think for yourself, how would the community respond, right? So you have someone who is saying, I don't want you to, I mean, I'm not going to play according to the rules of the game that you are setting. I'm not going to play according to the rules that you're saying about who is going to be responsible for my businesses or my education and well-being as a guardian. Now, what was the community's response to Spinoza's action? Again, we have no documents, but for such a community with its well-documented trigger-happy attitude towards bans, and we know that this community would issue bans more than any other community that we have on the record, it would be quite bizarre not to begin the process of Herem, right? If they are so trigger happy in terms of using the Herem, and if Spinoza is basically saying, I couldn't care less about what are your regulations. So I'm sorry, it's my dog. It's extremely likely that they will begin a process of Herem, or at least a series of other severe sanctions. I'm almost done. I have just one more scan. Now, given what, now again, what I'm doing a speculation, and I'm warning, and I'm telling that openly. So I ask you to think what would be the response of the community to this action of Spinoza 3.5 months before the Herem. And now I ask you to think about, knowing Spinoza's character, how would he respond to any kind of sanctions coming from the community, right? So given what we know about Spinoza and his temperament, how would he respond to the threat of Herem? And could he say, for example, I could not care less about you and your rabbis? I can easily imagine that, right? Could he say, don't threaten me with having no share in the world to come? Having no share in the world to come, by the way, is one of the implications of the Herem. If you are put on Herem, one of the magical implications is that you will have no share in the world to come, right? So if so, I think that we have here the abominable heresies, meaning it's very likely, or it is my suspicion, that when Spinoza is put under some threat by the community and they ask him to go back under the threat of Herem, he's basically telling them, I don't care about rabbinic authority. I don't care about the threats of not having no share in the world to come. You don't have any power over me. Now, is that a speculation? Absolutely. But I think it's a speculation that has both the monstrous deeds as part of that, and as well as the abominable heresies. There is another event that happened slightly before that, the arrest of Antonio Alvarez, another member of the community who had a debt. Spinoza owed him, he owed Spinoza some money, and Spinoza basically put him in prison, filed a complaint to the sheriff, and as a result put him in prison. Again, this could be a very strong violation of the laws of the community, that in case of debts, you must go and litigate within the community, go to the rabbinic court. Going to the sheriff is not a solution in such a case. So I put that aside. It's an event that happens. It's not 11,060. It's 1655. I mean, we are still not there. Now, one last point before I get to the conclusion: the debt affair might also explain why Rebecca de Spinoza, remember Spinoza's sister, the one who after Spinoza's death first wishes to come and see what she has, and then she hears that there is a debt, and she's saying, thank you, I don't want anything from him. I think the debt might have been already a sensible issue given the history of Spinoza. And it might be she was saying, okay, we don't know what is there in terms of the debt that Spinoza might or might not have. As it turned out, it was nothing close to the debt that Spinoza inherited from his father. But I think it can explain why she doesn't want to come into or to have any kind of contact with any kind of danger of getting herself into debt. Conclusion: we need more documents about what happened in the 3.5 months between the announcement on Spinoza as an orphan and as needing a guardian, and the Herem. I think it would be a genuine miracle if the two events are unrelated. What I could offer is just speculation, but I think the likelihood of the independence of these two events seems to me, I cannot say zero because everything is possible, but I think it's extremely unlikely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Yitzhak. I think the last argument is very convincing, given that as Spinozas, we don't believe in miracles.
You said.
Okay, the last speaker will be, speaker will be Jonathan Israel. Jonathan?
Your microphone is turned off, Jonathan. You need to turn on the microphone.
I was just saying, I agree with most of what Steve has said. One or two little bits that I rather disagree with what Yitzhak has just said, but I want to try to concentrate, if I can, in my 15 minutes on additional points or additional facts that haven't really been mentioned so far that I think are very relevant here. First of all, this debate about Odette Flessing, in my case, has been going on since the 1990s, because before her well-known article, which everyone has been referring to, was published, we had several discussions about it in bars in Amsterdam after the archives closed. She's a very good archivist and a good scholar, and I enjoyed those discussions very much, but we greatly disagreed. And I've never believed that the financial aspect, the bankruptcy case, just to give it that name for short. I'm sorry, there's a telephone persistently ringing just behind me, which I do hope is going to stop in a moment because it's disturbing my concentration. But I think there's a very close connection, just as Yitzhak was saying a moment ago, between the financial aspects of the last, I would say, 2 years since the death of Spinoza's father, Michael de Spinoza, in March 1654. Spinoza began settling, as far as he could, some of the debts that the firm was actually really bankrupt already in 1654. It had been quite a major firm, and just 4 or 5 years before, it had been at the height of its prosperity. Spinoza is clearly not only going to synagogue regularly, saying all the correct prayers through 1654 and 1655, being an observant Jew, but he is trying to do his best. That's very clear from the evidence that we can see from his financial transactions in 1654 and the first part of 1655 to pay off the debts. He pays off a number of major debts. I won't go into that now, but that's all in my biography of Spinoza, which, by the way, is reaching a fairly advanced stage now. It's much too long, which is the usual problem with my things, but it's there. So there is a big, there's a change of direction, a very drastic change of direction, which comes with the case which Steve and Yitzhak in particular have been talking about, before the Guardian's office in Amsterdam. So any person in Holland who was under 25, who had lost both their parents, could claim orphan status and be placed under the orphan's chamber. But there's another aspect to the legal case, which hasn't been mentioned so far, which is that just a week after the decision of the Orphans' Chamber in Amsterdam, a still higher court, the Hoge Raad in The Hague, who had received information about this from the Orphans' Chamber in Amsterdam, ruled that it was the case that under Spinoza's mother's will, he had preferential status, or rather under her marriage contract, the Ketubah, he had, her children would have preferential status, and that Michael de Spinoza had not respected Hannah Deborah, that's his second wife and Spinoza's mother's provisions for her children, but simply absorbed her dowry entirely into his own capital. So there is a clear offense as far as the Dutch courts were concerned on the part of Michael de Spinoza. And Spinoza was in the right in the sense that he had never been given access to money that had been allocated to him. He had simply accepted that everything was absorbed into his father's capital, and his responsibility once he took over the firm from March 1654 was to pay off his father's debts, which he was systematically trying to do for quite a long time. By the way, there seems to be, I can't go into a great deal of detail, because a lot of this is not very well known so far. But it seems to me that in the months after his father's death, the community did appoint an arbitrator, namely Geronimo Núñez da Costa, a very important, Mosaic Curiel, a very important merchant and figure in the community, to try to arbitrate some of these amazingly entangled financial problems that Spinoza, it must have been hellish for him. And I can quite understand that a young man of 23, then 24, who wants to get on with his philosophy finds it absolutely maddening that he has to spend all his time discussing debts and contested contracts and debts and so on. And it became very complicated and very harrowing, I'm sure. So there's a sense in which certainly some members of the community and some of the biggest financial debts were actually to New Christian merchants in Rouen, who had provided Spinoza's father with a lot of linens. And those debts were very large ones. And I'm sure that many major figures, both in Amsterdam and Rouen, were very angry with Spinoza. Now, but it's a complicated legal case, and it's not a simple one. So I don't think there's anything in the case itself which would justify a herem of great virulence. It has always seemed to me, and this was my point with discussing this with Odette, that of course there's a connection, a very complicated connection with the financial side, but it's quite clear from the wording of the herem itself, and thank you, Steve, for beginning the discussion with the exact precise text of the herem. Just one phrase, though, in the beginning where you say, since some days, the Portuguese, it's unos dias, I think, in the Portuguese, which literally means since some days, but in practice means for some time. That's a bit, that can't mean a very long time, so it couldn't be several years, but it's probably longer than some days, so probably means some months, I would suggest. That again would take us back perhaps to March and the Guardian case. Now, I haven't got how much time have I got? I've got many points that haven't been mentioned yet, and I don't want to take up too much time, but some of these points are important, so I don't want to completely
Why not 10 minutes? Is that okay?
Oh, okay, I'll try to do it in 10 minutes to get through what I want to say. Well, firstly, of course, there were bigger financial issues that were taken out of the hands of the community and brought to the magistrates of Amsterdam, much more important ones than Spinoza's case at just this time. For example, Geronimo Núñez's uncle, Lopo Ramirez, he got into such a row, he even went to the Amsterdam magistrates in the early 1650s, raised the question of Sephardic marriages that hadn't been registered with the city government, which was not strictly legal, to suggest that the offspring of marriages that hadn't been properly registered were illegitimate children. And he did this to prove that his own niece, Rebecca Nahr, who was supposed to inherit an absolutely enormous legacy of 116,000 guilders, being illegitimate, should actually be inherited by another relative of Rebecca's, who happened to be Lopo Ramirez's wife. Now, this scandal was such a big caused so much outrage in the community that there was a full-scale riot in the synagogue on the 29th of April, 1651. And the ins and outs of it were, again, very complicated. But it's interesting that the financial aspect was much, much more serious than in the Spinoza case, because it was on a bigger scale. And the question of marriage law, or the marriage status of Sephardic marriages being threatened, the whole thing was more important. So, of course, they put Lopo Ramirez under a ban, more or less at the same, just a bit before. It was actually in the summer of 1656, so more or less at the same time as the Spinoza herem. But it's interesting that the Lopo Ramirez herem, financially more important, legally more important, but he only gets a minor, the minor herem, and the wording of a minor herem. So let me say a little bit. So there's a very important difference in the legal thinking of the Ma'amad, of the Sephardic community in Amsterdam, between religious law and what they call bon gobierno, good government. So there were all sorts of rules. I think it was it Steve, or perhaps it was Pete who mentioned this. There were all sorts of rules, like, for example, one shouldn't give charitable alms to Ashkenazic beggars at the door of the Sephardic synagogue, which have got nothing to do with religious law, but which that was called bon gobierno, good government. So normally going outside the autonomy of the community in legal cases would incur, it seems to me, just a minor herem, not a major herem. Now, we do have the text of several other herems from the mid-17th century, including Spinoza's ally in the mid-1650s and late 1650s, Juan de Prado. And we have more information about what de Prado's offenses were. And we know that he was telling students in the higher classes of the school that the text of the Torah is corrupted, and there are many inconsistencies and mistakes, chronological errors, and so on, and so much so that the whole text is confused and defective. Now, since de Prado didn't know any Hebrew, it seems to me pretty obvious that he got this from his friend Spinoza. And I think Steve is absolutely right that the text of we have the text of the Herem for de Prado, and it's pretty damning and it's pretty vehement. But it's not as vehement, and it doesn't have as many curses, and it's not as violent as the Herem against Spinoza. So I think it's absolutely true, as Revach said a long time ago, that this, and I think Salomon also says this, it seems to me indisputable that the Spinoza Herem is uniquely vehement. It goes beyond the Herem declared against Juan de Prado or any other that you can find for the 17th century. And I would say that, there's no question that this has to be religious offenses. What are these really? It is obras and heresias, yes, both works and heresies, certainly. But Spinoza, by this point, I think had long been having doubts about both the text of scripture and the status of rabbinic law and all kinds of things. But what his personal views were, I think, counted for very little. That couldn't give rise to a violent herem like this. Such a situation could arise only through open defiance and causing scandal in the community. And Spinoza doesn't seem to be scandalizing the community or openly defying the rabbis and causing outrage. In sharp contrast to Lope Ramirez, who'd been doing this in 1651, he doesn't seem to be doing that. We can see this from his payments in the synagogue and the various entries about his promesas, his donations in the synagogue and so on. He seems to be a very orderly character. Revach already pointed this out until late 1655. So it's only perhaps in the 9 months or so before the Herem that he's being openly defied. And it seems to me that we do know exactly what Spinoza received the Herem for, because it can't be for his opinions, which the community was not interested in one's private opinions. They weren't really interested in even Uriel da Costa's opinions till that book was published about that caused so much outrage in 1623. And I tried to finish quickly, Dan, but just let me say that it seems to me very clear that rejecting the idea that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, or that the Old Testament is in any way a coherent and sacred text, as long as Spinoza kept this more or less to himself, would not have caused any kind of outrage. The problem was that he and de Prado, and they weren't the only ones, Ribera as well, were spreading the word about this and were telling young people and students this, and this is what was causing they were warned several times, and they were causing defiance. Now, just very, very quickly, of course, if you look at the 18th century chronicle of the community, which was a kind of official chronicle and based on a lot of sources, some of which haven't survived any today, by David Franco Mendes, which was completed in 1769, the Memorias, the history of the Portuguese and Spanish community in Amsterdam. He says Spinoza's perversity reached the point of giving the greatest scandal in the sight of the nation by abominably sowing his ideas about everything relating to tradition and even violating the Sabbath and festivals and communicating these to others. For these reasons, he was several times admonished by the rabbis and the parnasim of the community. And it seems very significant that Franco Mendes says that although the Herem was dated July 1656, he says that the actual ceremony, the blowing of the shofar and the imposing of the Herem, did not actually take place till 6 weeks later. So that Spinoza was warned what was going to happen to him, showed no signs of repentance or submission whatsoever, just as we would expect. I certainly agree with Yitzhak that Spinoza, unlike de Prado, Spinoza was not the kind to be either intimidated or to be even impressed by any of these incredible sequence of curses. But it was 6 weeks later in September, I've got the exact date somewhere, and that the actual ceremony of excommunication, if I'm allowed to use that word, took place. So I've got plenty to say also about Solano y Robles and other things which are very relevant to the discussion, but I don't want to go on too long, so perhaps I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Ronit, I know that you did not want to give an actual presentation, but is there anything that you would like to add
Well, I would like to respond on or agree a lot on what Pete said before, also about the event that was held in 2015, because I think one of the most important topics, or at least the reason why I wanted to organize this event, was mostly because of the symbolism of it. So it's rather fascinating to me how deep we can dig into the reasons of why this Herem was set to begin with, although I have my own ideas about them, which are not necessarily academic, but they have become the excommunication, or however you want to call it, of Spinoza, of course, has become a symbol. And indeed, until today, it is a topic we do discuss. And I spoke, Yitzhak Melamed, I spoke to him not in the synagogue, indeed, because he was not allowed to film inside, but he was allowed to film inside of the Etz Chaim, the 400-year-old library. And we had a very intense conversation in which we disagreed a lot, I might add. But I think it was an interesting opportunity at the time to also have a discussion with both religious leaders as academics. So that's why I think the event was successful after all, even though the ban, of course, wasn't lifted.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
We're going to open the floor now. If you have questions, comments, whatever, please use the raised hand function under reactions, and I'll call on you in the order in which you raise your hand. We've already got one question in the chat from Robert McClellan. Would you like to, Robert, would you like to ask your question?
It was just a general question about I wonder how it wouldn't do do to say that it was just only Spinoza, but it was the synagogue being afraid of its context, which was not run by the synagogues, but run by a Reformed Church government. And I was just wondering if that was any connection at all. It's a very minor thought.
Actually, it doesn't seem so minor to me, but would anybody on the panel like to address that?
I do think there was
Jonathan, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Steve, since you began, and then Jonathan.
Okay, I was going to say, yeah, I think there has to have been a political and social context to the Herem, because this was a refugee community. And we don't know how public a Herem it was, whether the Dutch had any inkling of what was going on. But, and here I'm speculating, the way in which Yitzhak was allowed to speculate, it may have been the Portuguese Jewish community's way of signaling to the Dutch, we can keep our house clean, and don't worry about us, we're not a haven for heretics.
Jonathan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just like to add that the timing, there's an amazing coincidence, because there's a huge row going on in the Staten van Holland, the legislature, the states of Holland, just at the same time in the summer of 1656, over how far to concede to the Dutch Reformed Church that stricter rules were needed to prevent Cartesian philosophers in the universities invading the sphere of theology. There have been several complaints from the theologians that philosophers were encroaching excessively on both on theology and on scripture exegesis. And the church was getting very annoyed about this and insisted that the states do something. So a compromise set of rules was drawn up, which was basically that philosophy and theology have to be kept separate. And philosophers can say whatever they like except about God, religion, and scripture, in which case they have to leave primacy to the theologians. That was the basic compromise. Now, this compromise was reached at exactly this time, as I say, in the summer of 1656. So it seems to me that there must be some connection in the sense that the Sephardic community wanted to show that amongst the tolerated fringe sects and religions, some were regarded as law-abiding and following basic rules. And some, especially the Socinian collegians and the Quakers, were regarded as unruly types who, and in a more evasive way, perhaps the Catholics to some extent, were not obeying the rules of toleration, restrictive rules of toleration as laid down by the Dutch authorities. And I think it was important to the Sephardic community to show that they were law-abiding, and that they were not allowing something like this that happened earlier in the Uriel da Costa case as well, where you remember it wasn't just the rabbis who were acting against Uriel da Costa in Amsterdam, but they did so rather remarkably jointly with the city magistrates, because they wanted to show that that they were, as it were, wanted to preserve the integrity of scripture according to the rules as laid down by the Dutch authorities. So I think there is in that sense a connection here.
Yitzhak, was that a thinker?
Yeah, just a quick point. I mean, I'm not so much, or at least I won't risk anything about what I'm saying now, but I very much doubt that the Reformed Church hypothesis has much behind that, for two reasons. First of all, I mean, it's a kind of a nice PC explanation. You know, the Jews didn't want to work to Herem. They were just forced because they didn't want to get trouble with. And no, I think, you know, Jews have. I mean, Amsterdam, we know that they used to have quite a lot of Haramim. So. Why should the Reformed Church know about Spinoza when he's 23 years old? I mean, we have no evidence, nothing, zilch.
No, I'm not suggesting that the Reformed Church knew about Spinoza, but they what I'm saying is that that the synagogue wanted to show that, like respectable churches, like the Lutherans, let's say, or tolerated churches in the Netherlands, they were not allowing philosophers to impugn the integrity of scripture by saying, for example, that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, or that the scripture is so full of defects and corrupt passages that it can't be regarded as a sacred text. This kind of thing, which is exactly what Spinoza and de Prado and Ribera were saying in the mid-1650s, and we know that. There are lots of sources that tell us that. We know that, and this is also what the Spanish friar and Pérez de Maltronilla were saying, that they had was their view in 1658. This is exactly what Levi de Barrios later on says that was in Spinoza's Apologia, which he wrote immediately after the expulsion in 1656, and so on. And so I think that is the point, that the synagogue had no objection to Cartesianism per se, but it did want to show the authorities that it didn't allow free thinkers, skeptics, and philosophers to treat scripture as if it were just any old text equivalent to any other text.
Jonathan, so
just a moment, Jonathan. I'm surprised that you said that Spinoza said that the Bible was so corrupt that it couldn't serve as a holy text. By his definition of what it is that makes a text sacred, I think scripture still counts as sacred, even if it has certain corruptions in it.
But I don't think this is how the rabbis would interpret Spinoza's view of scripture.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yitzhak, you were answering. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So just again, I mean, the question is, why would a Reformed church be afraid of the views of Spinoza? So if it's because of pantheism, then the community would have to hide the most important Kabbalistic work that was written there, meaning the works of Herrera. So that's cannot be the case. They are not going to hide Herrera. Do we know what were Spinoza's views about the Bible at that time? Not really. We have.
Oh, I don't agree with you. I think we do know that.
He was saying the Bible is not true.
That's the only text we have. Something he's saying that the Bible is not precisely as it is not precisely understood literally. Again, are these views? Can you find them within rabbinic sources? Yes, you can, all the time. I mean, Ibn Ezra is a source. Wait, no, I want to keep. Ibn Ezra is a major source. Yehuda Hasid is a major source. I can give you a whole list of rabbinic figures that will tell you, we know that this kind of text could not have been written at this point or at that point. Now, how public was this? As far as we know, it was something that was really small, local. Perhaps one person heard about it, perhaps another person heard about it. Do you think that this would be a reason for putting a ban? I doubt it. I had some response to Steve, but I don't.
Yitzhak, let me just say, you're treating Amsterdam as if it were like Hamburg or Venice or other well-established Jewish communities. We do know that Amsterdam used the Herem much more frequently and for a wider range of offenses than those other places. And so maybe in Venice or Hamburg, you wouldn't get a ban for ideas or opinions, but Amsterdam was a very unique community and would, I think, have gone that extra mile to enforce a kind of ideological, or at least prevent ideological nonconformity. And the same thing goes for his views on the Bible. Here you have a refugee Jewish community embedded in a Calvinist community. And if the Calvinist authorities got the impression that there were people in this community denying the divinity of the Bible, saying that it should not be read in a certain way, or even suggesting that
but
the
that's
law...
not denying the divinity of the Bible, Stephen. I mean,
well, let me finish. I think from those testimonies of the Inquisition, we can extrapolate just the kinds of things that Spinoza was saying, if we especially look just 5 years down the road when he starts putting these ideas down on paper.
Stephen,
Absolutely.
it's not 5 years down the road. It's 10 or 11, to be
Oh,
honest.
no.
What? I'm sorry, Jonathan. I mean, let me now respond. I mean, so we are talking about 56. So when we're speaking about 61. We don't have any text by Spinoza referring to the Bible, as far as I know.
Yes, but we have the Quarter for Handling, and the Quarter for Handling contains all kinds of statements which already, I mean, it may be that, well, equating God with nature, for example.
No problem with that. I mean, the chief rabbi of Hamburg is saying that God is nature is a holy opinion according to rabbinic law.
Saying that angels, demons, and the devil don't exist, that would certainly be a problem.
Maimonides' view, Maimonides' perfect view that demons, angels are really fairy tales.
And according to, let me just quote to you from Levi de Barrios tells us what was in the Apologia, which was, remember, written in 1656. That is, we don't have the text, but it's a very important fact that, where did I put that? It's a very important, I seem to have lost it, a very important text. Levi de Barrios tells us that he'd clearly seen it, and several people had seen it. He mentions it in one of his historical sections written in the early 1680s, and he says that it looks at first like a precious chalice, but it is actually full of poison. And then he goes through a list of things where Spinoza is degrading and debasing scripture in a way which he finds absolutely outrageous and scandalous. Yeah. Now,
Jonathan, I mean, something which appears extremely tasteful, and then when you look at that, it seems that it's full of heresy. Anyone who knows Maimonides and responses to Maimonides, that's a standard description of the Guide to the Perplexed. Literally. I mean, literally. A wonderful text. Once you start reading into that, you'll find all of these kinds. So where precisely?
Maimonides does not equate God with nature.
Maimonides is doing things. God, I mean, all the Kabbalists, not all, I'm sorry, but most of the Kabbalists equate God with nature. But Maimonides is doing things far worse than equating God with nature.
But Maimonides, several experts on Maimonides have made it clear that although for Maimonides that there is a sense in which in a spiritual sense that nature flows from God, that God cannot be equated with the matter, the material.
Absolutely, Maimonides does, to my mind, Maimonides does not equate God with nature.
Yeah,
huge amount, something like 70% of the Kabbalists do that, and Maimonides is making claims which are actually much more problematic. So again, in this context, I mean, I think that what seems to me that you are trying to impose on Spinoza ideas of heresy, which are not necessarily working within the rabbinic context.
Well, we do have the reports. We know that there were reports about Spinoza's heresies to the rabbis that were collected because they're
but the question is,
if we don't have the reports themselves. But we do have the references to his friend de Prado, and one of them is that, for example, de Prado says that why should we regard the Torah as more significant than what Muhammad wrote, for example? Are you going to tell me?
And I think,
are you going to tell me that these rabbis would have no objection to that?
No. I think that rabbinic authority is primarily, to my mind, the issue at stake here, right? And that's what I would try to argue. But I think that we should agree with you. Yeah. Okay. So that's the whole. That's the entire story. Go ahead.
Ed Curley wanted to get in a word.
Sorry.
On exactly this issue, I think. Well, maybe not exactly, but close to this issue. You have to unmute.
Okay. So I wrote something on the chat thing that it seems to me that Yitzhak downplays the importance of the theological issues by saying that pantheism was an acceptable view among intellectuals in the community, or more broadly within the Jewish philosophical tradition, and that the denial of immortality was not a strong ground for the ban. But according to Solano, Spinoza also denied that the law of Moses was the true law.
I think that's right.
Not in there, that wasn't right. But presumably this would lead him not to feel obliged to obey it. So that it seems to me reasonable to expect that he wouldn't have faithfully observed the laws. I mean, the point was made that he did obey it faithfully up until fairly close to the time of the Herem, but if you don't believe the law is the true law, you're not going to be strongly motivated to obey it, I think.
And it's not just Solano. Ed, you're absolutely right in what you say. And Levi de Barrios, I've now found that quote that I wanted in his Triunfo del Gobierno Popular, 1682. He says, in the Apología, that Spinoza in 1656 claimed, los judíos no tienen obligación de observar la ley de Moises en cuanto no tienen imperio. So the Jews have no obligation to observe the law of Moses, la ley mosaica, when insofar as they don't have their own state. And this is clearly Spinoza's view in 1656. We have several sources stating that.
Okay. Well, let me first of all respond to, I agree with that actually. So I think that the issue of the law of Moses, and again, there's a small nuance here. The question is whether it's the authority of scripture or authority of the rabbis. I know that it would sound odd, but I think for the rabbis, and they had an argument for that, the authority of the rabbis was more important. I mean, it's a long story. The authority of the rabbi is more important than the authority of the scriptural text. Yes. Why? We can I'll be happy to discuss that. But I think that I agree with that. I think that the story here is about the authority of the law. The interesting story is that if you look at this, at the testimony of Solano, I think he also mentioned the fact that Spinoza is still keeping kashrut, which is a bizarre thing.
No, he doesn't say that.
He's not eating pork. He's saying that he was offered pork.
He doesn't. He says that Reynoso and the other Sephardim who were coming there, not De Prado, but Dr. Reynoso and Samuel Pacheco, the other Sephardim who were coming to
Solano,
they were not eating pork.
Solano is the monk that is giving the testimony to the, let me see.
There's the monk Solano and there's the infantry officer Perez de Malchonia.
Right.
And
so
Solano
one of them,
Solano says that the other Sephardim were not eating pork, but he doesn't say
No, Jonathan. Look again at the text. He's saying that Spinoza is still not eating pork, which is bizarre. Check it out.
Hey guys, can I say that there are other people with hands up? And I think we should open it up. There are other people with hands up.
I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you. I put your hand down by mistake, Stephen. Did you want to raise a different question?
No, I think we should give other people the opportunity. That's fine. Thanks, Dan.
Okay.
Can I get in? Because I didn't actually finish what I wanted to say.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And that is on the issue of pantheism. Your defense of Spinoza's theological views by saying that pantheism was an acceptable view in the Jewish tradition, common view, assumes that Spinoza was a pantheist in the sense in which you understand that term, which is that he identified God with the whole of nature. And I think that's just false. It depends largely on a misunderstanding of the distinction between Natura Naturans and Natura Naturata in part 1 of the Ethics. I could go on a considerable length about this, but I won't.
So Ed and I have a long disagreement on this issue. I respect Ed's view. Just quickly, I think that both Spinoza and the mainstream of the Kabbalah more precisely are panentheist. We can get into this discussion, but again, there are many other people.
Pete, you had your hand up.
Yeah, that's right.
Or was it in connection with this?
No, it's a different topic. So I wanted to react to the presentations by Steve and Yitzhak and Jonathan. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So I had three. Wrote down 3 points. The one thing is that you were all referring to the text of the Herem, and it's interesting to see that Steve, New Translation, translated Hadias as a few days ago. I think that Jonathan was right in relativizing that by saying that it's probably a bit longer than a few days. The whole affair was not a matter of just a couple of days. And I have the impression that this expression in Portuguese, my Portuguese isn't that strong though, but I have the impression that it means something like for some time.
Yes.
It's rather vague. It's usually translated as a long time ago in the translations of the Herem so far, but it seems to be much vaguer than that, and it leaves all sorts of possibilities. So that's one point, and it's interesting to see that there's related to this is that, of course, we do not know how this nota de Herem, how this notice, how this rundown of the Herem relates to the actual text read. So that's always a difficult question in discussing the text of Herem. Now, another point is the question of the what exactly was it that Spinoza was? What exactly were his deeds, his acts? I think this is explicitly said in the Herem itself when it says the heresies that he practicava, and taught. So he was speaking his ideas to other people. Very classic accusation of corrupting the young. In fact, that's going on here. And this was, of course, politically very dangerous indeed, because the Jewish community was tolerated in Amsterdam on the specific condition that it would keep all sorts of controversies within. They would not allow controversies to arise within the community. That would put their status of tolerated community at risk. Now, another point about I was curious about the Yitzhak's point about the Rebecca's waiving the inheritance. That cannot possibly have been related to the debts that Spinoza incurred when he was still in business, because as soon as they heard from about Spinoza's death in 1677, they traveled. Rebecca and her stepson, which was also her and Spinoza's nephew, Daniel. What's his name again? I forget his name.
Daniel de Cáceres.
So they immediately traveled to The Hague to claim the inheritance, if there was any. So they asked the notary to make a full inventory of the stuff that was in Spinoza's room, and when they found there was no inheritance left, only some debts to be paid for the funeral and so on and so forth, they waived the inheritance, and Spinoza did not have anything to do with the debts that his father had incurred before that, because the very.
I didn't say that.
What?
I didn't say that he was about to inherit, that she was about to inherit the debt of his father. I was saying that the inheritance of debt was possibly an issue in the mind, let's say.
Yeah, but not related to the debts of 1656. This was
yeah, of course not. I mean, there were 20 years between them.
In your PowerPoint, you said something. This must be you made a link between the 1656 Spinoza's being declared a minor and this and Rebecca claiming the inheritance.
I said that given the fact that that there was a story with inheritance, which I suspect inheritance of debt, which I suspect caused a major problem in the family. When you look at the letter of Rebecca, when she's saying she doesn't want to have anything to do with that, I suspect that it was a response. It's, again, I suspect. I mean, we have the letter. The letter is saying, I hear that there is a debt here. I don't want to have anything to do with that.
So, But that was a matter of Spinoza having spent all his money at the time, and they still had to pay for his funeral. So, okay. Well, that were my remarks. Yeah.
Great. Alberto Marama.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is on an aspect that has been touched upon by Itzhak and Stephen in particular. And I was curious to understand where they see the main differences practically and conceptually between a Herem, like that of Spinoza, and an excommunication, broadly understood. And also if Pete and Jonathan have an opinion about that. Thank you.
I would suggest, and here I don't claim to be an expert on excommunication in the Catholic Church, but I would suggest that the grounds for an excommunication in Catholicism are typically narrower and have to do with liturgical or doctrinal matters, whereas a Herem really is a broad kind of social, liturgical, and economic ostracism of a person from a broader community and not necessarily from the sacraments or from the church itself. And the range of offenses for which one could earn a Herem seem to be quite a bit broader than the range of offenses for which one would receive an excommunication within Catholicism. But again, I'm happy to be corrected by somebody who knows much more from within Catholicism.
Would anybody like to speak to that? Jonathan.
Just another comment about the Herem. Between 1622 and 1683, 36 men came under the Herem. Usually this was a brief affair and even a fairly routine matter, disciplinary, just as Steve said, for a wide range of issues, absolutely. But in only 4 cases, including Spinoza and the second Herem issued against De Prado, was the ruling never rescinded. In other words, in nearly all cases, you get usually a very brief period, as in the case that Steve mentioned earlier. Then as soon as the person concerned expresses their contrition and submits according to, in the way that's required of them by the community, the Herem gets rescinded. And that is the normal pattern. And there, we don't have any evidence of any other case where the wording of the Herem is it is altogether unique in this case. So I don't think you can compare the Spinoza Herem with the others. And since, and I agree with several of the speakers have said that this cannot be for, and I slightly disagree with Steve here, actually, although normally I agree with Steve on nearly everything, but I think he's exaggerating the role of Spinoza's views. I think it's not so much Spinoza's views, but Spinoza's defying the rabbis and influencing other people, especially younger people. But
with his views,
that is the problem.
Right? Yeah, but
with his views.
I think we are total agreement that it's not that he had these beliefs, but rather that they were beliefs he was discussing, presenting to others. Yeah, no question. I think we're in agreement on that.
Good.
And can I just 2 quick points? Yes. So first of all, let me share with you just an item from Odette's article. So here's Herman Priest Solomon asserts that the formulation of Spinoza's Herem bears a strong resemblance to an excommunication brought by mediators from Venice 40 years earlier. So at least 2 scholars who worked on it seems to say, well, there is a similarity between the Herem on Spinoza and the Herem that is used earlier in the community. I also suspect, and Solomon is a major figure to my mind. Now, I also suspect that when we are looking at this, again, I don't read Portuguese. I use my Latin in order to understand whatever I can from this text. But when you look at the records of the community and you say there is a record of a Herem, it means what the record is giving you is just the fact that there was sometime pronounced a Herem. What was the text? In most cases, my assumption is that we simply don't have it. I think what you have in the case of Spinoza is that you have a display of the full of the text. It would be interesting to compare when we have more examples of the full text. I think, as a matter of fact, I mean, there were scholars who thought that the text was a major invention of, or a kind of special compilation by Molterra, which, again, nothing in the formula of the Herem, every word is taken from the Kolbo. There is nothing original about it. And in fact, the text of the Herem in the original formula in the Kolbo is about 20 times longer. So it will be a much more. So again, you can get excited about all of the maledictions, but well, when you look at the larger context, it's actually a small excerpt from the longer text. Now, with regard to comparison with excommunication and Herem, there are a huge amount of differences. You can put a Herem on yourself, actually. It's perfectly legitimate. But most important is that Herem is local. And Herem, so excommunication usually is announced by a bishop, right? Or the Pope, a bishop of Rome. Herem is not necessarily to be announced by a rabbi. In fact, in many cases, it's announced by the civil authority, the civil leadership of the community. And we know that in Amsterdam, it was the non-rabbinic leadership of the community. So there are so many things. I think that there is, as far as I can see, I think that these two practices are some sort of cousins, but nothing more than them.
Okay, Max Brecher. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah,
there.
Okay. I'm unmuted now. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for this extremely interesting presentation, and to actually even open my mouth and say something is extreme chutzpah, especially when there are so many world famous experts here. However, what I think is that we've tended to lapse into a little bit of what the Dutch call common-noking, and we've gotten a little bit too myopic about the case. It reminds me of the joke when you put 3 rabbis in a room discussing one issue, you'll wind up with 15 different opinions. What I think is very interesting about the whole story, we're talking about a very young Spinoza. And what I was really surprised at, he was basically a good boy trying to do everything right. And he's going to the synagogue and all that. And then all of a sudden he becomes, burning down the house, a flamethrower. What was happening? And I mean, this isn't really a question. This is a point of consideration. I don't think anybody can really answer this, but it's a point as a novelist, I kind of consider these things. What happened to him in that time where he all of a sudden exploded and says, my God, this is all a bunch of bullshit. He was going to the synagogue. He was doing it by the book, more or less. And then all of a sudden he says, it's all garbage. And at such a young age to dare all that is an incredible transformation. And what happened? Where is he coming from? Who's helping him? Who's whispering in his ear? So that's my point.
Jonathan, you.
Yeah, of course, this is a crucial stage, a crucial transition in Spinoza's biography. And so it's something I've been thinking about a great deal over many years. But I haven't really changed my view since the article in that same 2002 volume where Odette Flessing's article appears, which is that there's a big difference between Spinoza's private views, his views, which in my opinion go back considerably further than 1656, and his outward behavior behavior in the community. And what makes the difference, I think, and he tells us this himself. I don't know why scholars are so reluctant to accept the autobiographical value and relevance of the opening pages of his first surviving text, the Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect, where he says that the lure of wealth and status had such a hold on him that even after he decided that the life of philosophy and the pursuit of truth was a higher form of life than being a merchant and looking for profits and for status, he still couldn't break away from that. His father had been very successful, but he also had responsibilities. Remember, he had a younger brother. He had he had his sisters. One of his sisters had died. He had his other sister, and so on. Well, the other responsibility was, of course, his father's firm and all these debts, which he tried to settle at first. And I think the answer is that he was law-abiding and was an observant Jew, going regularly to the synagogue and making his donations and all the rest of it until the autumn of 1655. What changed was that he realized that he wasn't able to pay off all the debts, and that he was stuck in a very complicated entanglement of disputes, especially with these two New Christian merchants in Rouen, but with lots of other people. He couldn't settle all the debts because he thought he could at first, because he didn't realize the firm was bankrupt. There was a lot of capital and it was quite a big firm, but it was completely bankrupt. The losses during the First Anglo-Dutch War between 1652 to 1654 have wiped it out. So that's very recent, and it was a big disaster. But the extent of the disaster he didn't realize until 1655, when he realized that the choice was either to spend the rest of his life trying to pay off the debts or finding some way out of this predicament. That is when he turned to the orphans' chamber. He went to the decision of the orphans' chamber is March 1656, is 2 years after the death of his father. So he'd been trying for 2 years to find some other solution. So it was a kind of last resort. But once from the autumn of 1655, he realized that honor, status, and money were not going to be his in any case. He wasn't going to have any money. All the money had gone, all the status had gone. The family was now reduced in every sense and humiliated in terms of the status it had before. Well, what's the point of keeping up appearances if you've lost the position you had? There's no point. So you might as well come out with all your real opinions, that what the rabbis have to say is all nonsense and so on, which he'd been thinking for years before this. So I think the change is in the presentation, not in Spinoza's thinking. The change is in Spinoza's behavior, not in what was his intellectual positions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that makes sense.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Erica?
Okay, I'm going to ignore all of the famous people in the room and just focus on argument. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, and again, this is hopefully no offense yet. So I do think that there's something a little bit strange about the structure of a couple of ways that this one structure of an argument that you make throughout your presentation, that Spinoza's idea of X couldn't possibly have been a reason for the condemnation because someone else wrote X. Someone else has X in has published about X, has X, a book about X in their library. And it strikes me that, or Spinoza didn't actually believe X, so that couldn't have been a reason for a condemnation. And it strikes me that both of those kinds of things aren't necessarily, I don't think those are great. So I think that in terms of speculating, one thing we can know about, when a decision is made about something someone believes, they don't have to actually believe it. All that's necessary is that someone thinks they believe it, right? So I think that the more details we can get about the community's decision-making, these specific examples, these tell us, right? Like whether or not this was a cause for Spinoza, this specific individual saying this in this very specific community, right? Amsterdam, not Venice, or a more established community at this particular time. That's really what can give us insight. And so I was hoping for more of that from your presentation on this sort of rabbinic tradition. And instead, I feel like we went in the opposite direction and gave us more sort of in general, here's what this might look like. So I don't know, is that fair as a challenge?
To whom? I mean,
To whom?
To you, because the idea, if Spinoza, Spinoza at no point had to have any of these beliefs. This could be in everyone's library, but the thing is, an idea in a library, like Copernicus, didn't get to be sort of hairy until people started talking about it later, right? So that kind of thing.
So, okay, quickly, let's suppose that that pantheism was the reason for the excommunication, for the Herem, whatever. Now, on what seems to go strongly against that is the fact that when you look at the writings of Shaul Motera, for example, he'll say time and again in his sermons that God is a place where the world occurs. That seems to me pretty much pantheism, right? God is the place where the world occurs. So why would someone who thinks that God is the place where the world occurs would put a herem on? I mean, everything is possible. Moreover, you look at the teacher of most of these figures, which is the Abraham Cohen Herrera. He will repeat the claim that God and nature are one and the same. So why should, if God is nature is such a horrible heresy, how come that they all admire Herrera as the most important rabbinic authority in Amsterdam?
Well, Yitzhak, maybe that's a reductio ad absurdum of the pantheist reading of Spinoza.
Why? Let's explain.
Because he got a herem in Amsterdam. You're suggesting he wouldn't have gotten a herem for pantheism. Therefore, his views on God must have seemed, at least to the authorities there in the community, to have been a lot worse than any kind of...
You're assuming that the reason for the herem is pantheism. On the other hand, what we do...
No, I was saying it wasn't. I'm suggesting that I think his views on God probably struck the leaders of the community as something very different from pantheism. I won't use the A word, but they regarded... Because again, the testimony in 1658 is that Spinoza was saying God exists only philosophically.
Well, but when a philosopher is saying that God exists only philosophically, it seems, at least for me, what exists philosophically seems to be quite significant, right?
It wants to come in.
If I can break in here quickly. I mean, one thing we know Spinoza held, but at least by the time of the Theological Political Treatise, is that God cannot be a lawgiver. And that connects very closely with the report of Solano and others that he denied that the law of Moses was the true law.
Mm-hmm.
So
I agree with that.
Without settling the question whether he was a pantheist or not, we don't have to look very far to find something Spinoza believed that would have been grounds for excommunication, or herem rather.
That's right. But I think that, again, we need to... my claim is that we're missing a lot of information. There were actions, there were obras, and I want to understand. My claim is that we need to know what are these obras in order to get a reasonable reconstruction of the events that occurred.
Can I introduce something here that Richard Stryer put in the chat that we haven't talked about? What he suggested is maybe the obras were Spinoza's teaching, which might have been connected directly with those sorts of doctrines.
Yeah.
Teaching over and above just simply believing.
I think that makes perfectly good sense.
Not just teaching, can I just add that there are several reports, again, Levi de Barrios, of of ugly scenes in evening classes, such as in the Academia Kete Torah, which met several days a week to discuss questions of Torah in the evening, where the Barrios reports later that he doesn't refer to Spinoza by name, but uses an interesting pun on his name, speaking about thorns and prados and meadows, to an almighty row where they'd obviously been simply rejecting or ridiculing Rabbi Mortera in front of all these people. Now that would be an obra. If you start a big argument to make the rabbi or contradict the rabbi in a way which is which detracts from his authority in front of the community, that would certainly count as an obra.
Yes.
So too, I think with casual conversation where you're spreading your views or at least expressing your views. I think we should take the word teaching here fairly figuratively, not too narrowly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, obras appear several times, and if obras is just the same thing as opinions, then it seems to be redundant. I think that when someone is saying horrible obras,
well,
there's
a lot of redundancy in the Herem document to begin with.
No.
Per stam.
No, but that's, Stephen, that's where, again, the redundancy in the Herem is not the work of the Jewish community there. In fact, the redundancy, the repetition is precisely word per word what you find in the formula of the Kolbo. What is important is the part of the Herem which is dealing specifically with this case. And this part of the Herem, I think it gives us the most significant information we might have. And I think that if there is there are three elements there, which is opinions, obras, and teaching. The fact that he was teaching some of these opinions, and I think all the three of them should have played some role.
Mm-hmm.
So Yitzhak, what do you think the obras were?
I think some actions. I mean, I think that going precisely. I think that the obras are precisely the documents that the document most likely the document that Odette found. The fact that he appeals to a court is breaking the community, is breaking the autonomy of the community. He's appealing to an outside court in order to impose this outside court on members of the Jewish community. That's precisely the kind of obras. I know that it would sound, it would sound bizarre for people if you're not thinking from within the view that the autonomy of the community is so important. But I think that's precisely, or precisely, I don't know, but I think it's most likely. Yeah.
Well, I think that's true. That's absolutely right, Yitzhak. But that's just one more of a whole series of obras.
I agree. I mean, the fact that he's, what was the name of that guy, Alvarez? The fact that he's putting that person in prison, again, without appealing to the authority of the community. It's not, so it's not, the issue is, it's not financial. It is a theological issue. It is a question whether you accept the authority of the rabbinic leadership. It's a deep theological issue, just not precisely the kind of deep theological issue that will be significant necessarily in other communities, in other religious communities.
I think we've come to the end of our time. Thank you all for a very, very lively session. And for those of you who are fans of Spinoza, we are going to have another session on Spinoza on May 17th, where we're going to talk about a text that is unfortunately not talked about very much, which is Spinoza's Hebrew grammar. So you're all welcome back for that. And then next Tuesday, we're going to have a session on Pierre-Sylvain Régis at the edge of Cartesianism. And you're all welcome to come for that as well.
Thanks very much for moderating today, Dan.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dan.
It honestly was one of the most challenging moderations ever.
It was pretty immoderate.
Great session.
But thank you all. It was a great session.
Thank
I'm
you.
really, really glad that both the participants and the audience was able to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.